In your paper, I'm not gonna try it. Ross, can you pronounce that for me?
Is this the amelioration law?
Yes. So in that paper,
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. Today we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Katharine Jenkins, who is a lecturer here at the University of Glasgow. Katharine's work is in social philosophy, more specifically in the ontology of social categories. We discuss what it means to say that a category is socially constructed. We dive a bit deeper into her papers, which we'll link to in the show notes. And we finish off by touching on the implications of Katharine's research outside of philosophy. We really enjoyed recording this episode and we hope you enjoy listening to it. Here are some thoughts on category construction and social kinds. Okay, Katharine, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you today?
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Great, we're really excited. Let's dive straight into it. So
Sure.
why don't you tell us how you like sum up your own research interest and the kind of things you like thinking about philosophically?
I think that probably the central thing in my research is the idea of social categories or kinds or groups. What is it to be a woman, for example, or to be white, or to be any one of these other categories that seems to shape how we are and how we live together. And I'm interested in that from a kind of metaphysical point of view, which is to say I'm interested in thinking about how these things exist, what do they depend on, how are they maintained, questions like that. So I think the main categories that I focus on in my research, well, probably the main one is gender. I also think a bit about race, and recently I've started to think a little bit about disability. So I'm interested in that from the perspective of social justice, understanding how when in a world that's been shaped by oppression and where the categories of our identities have been shaped by that oppression, where does that leave us and what do we do about that?
Great. Sure. I wonder if you could maybe go into a bit more detail and say what it is for a category to be social or socially constructed. That's kind of like a common philosophical term, but I wonder if maybe for our listeners, they could go into a bit more about what that means for a category to be kind of socially constructed.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that there's a kind of intuitive way of thinking about this, which is, so it seems, it's a fact about me that I'm a certain height, I'm 5'10". So it seems like I could have that property even in a world where I was the only person. But if you think about some of the other properties that I have, so I am a university lecturer. It seems like if it was just me all on my lonesome, I couldn't really be a university lecturer in the same sense, right? That depends on there being other people around me and on us doing things together that we might think of as engaging in social practices. There would have to be universities and people who wanted to be students and structures that make sense of that, where we act together in ways that make it the case that I am a university lecturer. And so the first one of those, the height, that seems like it's maybe a natural or a biological property of me. But it's not a natural or biological property of me that I'm a university lecturer. That's a social property. It's something that I have or that I am only in the context of my relationships with other people in a society. So that's the kind of rough idea of the distinction between a natural or biological property and a social property. Obviously, philosophers get excited about exactly how to draw that line, and that's a complicated question, but that's the rough idea.
all right, that's very interesting. In your paper, I'm not sure I can pronounce it right. I'm not gonna try it. Ross, can you pronounce that for me?
Is this the amelioration law?
Yes. So in that paper,
we should say, so it's amelioration and inclusion, right?
Yes.
That's the name of the paper.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found interesting was that you were making a distinction between two kinds of understanding of this social construction, of these social entities. The one being, and please do tell me if I'm wrong in my understanding of your paper, but the one was from an individual perspective, so in how an individual navigates the social reality around them. And then the second one was how the social context shapes the geography around that individual. Is that correct?
That's definitely along the right lines. Yeah. So the way I would put it is that to be a member of a social category, I think the one I'm thinking about in that paper is the category woman, but you could think of others. There's something that it is to be socially positioned as a member of that category. So there's something that it is to be treated in ways that are characteristic of women in your social context. and to kind of have your life be shaped by that as you move through different social spaces. That's really about the kind of meanings that other people are imposing onto you and the material implications that that has for how your life goes. And I think that that's a very important part of what it is to be a member of a social category. But I think there's another way of looking at social categories, which is about the meanings of that category for the individual's own lived experience. So how does your sense of who you are and your vision of yourself and your sense of identity, how is that shaped by or responsive to these categories being created in your social context? So there's something that it's like for me to be treated regularly as a woman, to experience certain kinds of characteristic patterns of outcomes. So for example, to be kind of caught up in a society where that might lead to me being paid less than if I was a man, for example. That's one thing. And my sense of myself as a woman, my feeling that when people say women, I'm part of who they mean, my feeling that woman is a label under which I can make sense of my life and my own experiences, that's something slightly different. In my case, I think that I'm both treated as a woman and also have a sense of identity as a woman, and there's a correspondence there. I think it's fair to say that for some people, it's possible that they might be being treated by the world according to one idea of gender, but have an experience of their own identity that departs from that. I think that's the situation that some trans people might be in some of the time. So that's one reason why I think that it's the distinguishing between those two senses of being part of a social category is worth doing, is partly because it seems to me, from what I've hear about what other people say about their experiences, that some people have the experience that they come apart quite radically, and so I think that's something that's important to make space for and accommodate in how we think about social categories philosophically.
One thing I think it might be helpful maybe to clarify for our listeners here is this idea of social category or a socially constructed category being constructed badly, or there being work to be done with how it should be constructed. Is that something you could kind of introduce us to as a kind of area of debate in philosophy? Or
yeah, so I think that what's interesting to me is that injustice seems to be, or oppression, or these other kind of evaluative labels seem to be reserved for things that are products of human activity and that we could imagine in some sense potentially holding people to account for. So in that sense, I think that recognizing that certain, or thinking of a certain category, woman, for example, as the product, as a social phenomenon, as a socially constructed category, opens the door to thinking about, whether it should be that way or it should be otherwise. So there's a kind of family of accounts of gender and also of race where there's a kind of intellectual tradition of people thinking about those categories in terms of being products of an oppressive social system. So you have a society that's sexist, you have a society that's racist. One way of thinking about that is that race or gender exists before the injustice, before the oppression, and then the injustice consists of people being treated differently or worse on the basis of their gender or race. But there's another intellectual kind of tradition, and some philosophers who work in this tradition include the philosopher Charles Mills, Monique Wittig, Catherine McKinnon. These are some important figures. So this other way of thinking about it would say that's not quite right. Actually, it's the injustice that produces the categories. The categories come into existence. So categories of race, for example, come into existence through racist ways of organizing society. It's not there beforehand and then the injustice sits on top. Rather, the injustice makes the category and shapes it to be what it is. And the same for gender. I find those views very interesting. I find them quite fruitful. I think I'm inclined to adopt a view of that kind as at least as part of what it is to be a member of those kinds of social categories. So if that's your view, then if we think of social categories as being kind of created partly by how other people treat you on the basis of seeing you as a certain type of person, then it's natural to say that, well, for some of these categories, a woman might be one example, Black might be another example. The treatment that you get for being in that category that kind of makes that category what it is characteristically going to be an inferiorizing, a kind of maybe even dehumanizing kind of treatment, certainly a discriminatory kind of treatment. So that I think, opens a really interesting question of whether being placed into that category might be wrongful in and of itself. So if what it is to be a woman, in at least one sense of the word, is to be treated in ways that are less favorable, maybe ways that are even dehumanizing, then it seems that if I'm socially constructed as a woman, I've been subject to an injustice right there, just in that very fact. We don't need to wait to find out what particular bad things might have happened to me on the basis of being seen as a woman. The very fact that that's how I'm being socially positioned seems automatically to kind of place me in a disadvantageous position, to treat me as less with less worth than I deserve. And my kind of something that I'm thinking about at the moment, or I think about in more recent work, is the idea that type of injustice is maybe worth picking out and paying attention to. So the label I give that is ontic injustice. So ontic, because it relates to ontology, the issue of what there is and how it exists, and injustice because it seems like a wrong. The other part of it is that I think that when we ask the question, well, what is it to be a woman? I think that there's a sense, and this is the kind of structurally imposed sense, in which the story we tell in response to that question wants to include the fact that you're more likely to be, for example, harassed on the street. I think that if we try and define what the social category of woman is without making reference to those kind of characteristic modes of treatment directed at women, we've gone a bit wrong. I think it wants to be part of the picture in terms of the answering that question. Well, what is it to be a woman? That's my take. That you can go different ways on that. There are definitely alternative views out there that wouldn't take that view, that would say, no, there's something that it is to be a woman, and then it's also an extra fact that you would be, if you're a woman, you're more likely to be harassed in those ways. So that's the way you can go. But I personally want to bring that characteristic social treatment in as part of what makes it the case that someone is a woman, or the story about what it is to be a woman in a certain society.
I was wanting to get to that, but I think this is a great point to move on to your paper, and so we can get more into it. So I'm talking about your paper here, Amelioration and Inclusion, Gender Identity and the Concept of Women, from 2016. And so to get into that, what I took you to be doing in that paper was developing that kind of endeavor you just spoke about, and Haslanger's work of trying to pin down the concept of women and what should and should not be included in that.
So what she was trying to do is she was trying to say, well, how is it useful to think about the category of woman in order to do social justice work, in order to kind of try and be part of moving us towards a more just society? And she was saying is that focusing on these kind of quite negative modes of treatment, thinking of being a woman as being someone who is subordinated in a particular way, specifically subordinated because you're perceived to have what's thought of as a female body, roughly. She was saying that that's a productive and useful way of thinking about gender for the purposes of doing feminist theorizing. And I think that that's part of the truth, but it's not the whole truth, because thinking about the category of woman that way leaves out some trans women. Now, it definitely includes many trans women, because many trans women are perceived as having female bodies and are oppressed on that basis. So many trans women do count as women on this, the way of thinking about woman that Sally Haslanger was suggesting at the time. However, it also excludes some trans women, namely trans women who are not perceived in accordance with how they identify, but are misgendered in society and perhaps perceived as men, or perhaps perceived as kind of sitting outside gender in a problematic way. Which is not to say that we should try and do everything with one concept, right? So I actually came to the view that there isn't a single way of thinking about gender that will do everything that we might ask it to do in feminist theorizing. And so what I said is, look, we need to supplement this. We also need to think about gender as an aspect of someone's identity that's to do with their sense of their place in the world. So in that paper, I suggested that if you're asking, like, how should feminists use the term woman, or how should feminists think about the category of woman kind of going forward to be useful for feminist aims, for gender emancipation, you're going to need to think of that as coming apart into two things. One of them relates to that kind of structurally imposed oppressive categorization, and one of them relates to gender as we experience it as a part of our identities. So it's kind of adding that second thing into what Haslanger was already saying, and saying, look, we actually need both.
That's really interesting.
Great story about how you came up with this revision to Haslanger's view. And that story, if I'm not mistaken, was linked primarily to a night march that you were organizing.
Yeah. So in terms of how I came to that way of thinking, it was strongly influenced by an experience I had when I was a PhD student, where I was part of a committee at the university that was helping to organize a Reclaim the Night March. So if you haven't heard of Reclaim the Night, it's a kind of feminist event, usually takes place in the autumn as the nights are getting darker. And the idea is that it's a protest against the fact that women are often told that for our own safety, we shouldn't go out at night, or we shouldn't go out at night without taking a man with us, something like that. So it's about a kind of it's a protest against sexual violence and against the idea that sexual violence that women need to respond to sexual violence by limiting their own activities, rather than that we all need to respond to sexual violence by making it stop happening. So that's what Reclaim the Night is about. And traditionally, it's a women-only event. So it's quite a specific type of feminist event, and it has a kind of quite specific reason for being women-only. But when I was on this organising committee, obviously, it's all very well thinking women-only, but what do you put on the posters? How do you communicate that? So it was actually a very friendly conversation that we were part of on this committee. Like, for example, we were all clear that we wanted to welcome all trans women and make sure that all trans women felt really welcome and included in this event. That was not controversial. We also had some things about, were women who had a carer, perhaps if they were disabled, their carer was a man, or they needed to bring up a child and that child was a boy, something like that. So we had some various kind of like caveats there. But there was this kind of more fundamental question that we couldn't get straight on, which is that there was a collective feeling that there were some people who wouldn't identify themselves as women, but who were still targeted by the kind of behavior that the march was protesting against. So that might be people who were trans men or were non-binary people, but who were regularly, for whatever reason, perceived as women or perceived as having female bodies, for example. We felt that those people's needs and interests were very much part of what the march was about, and we wanted them to be welcome. So if we just said this march is for women, self-identifying women, perhaps, that didn't seem to include those people. So we were in a bit of a quandary, and we went around the houses trying to find a wording that would capture all of the people who we felt were kind of directly welcome on this march. And then obviously there'd be the caveats about male carers and bringing your son along and stuff like that. And the conclusion that we came to was that we actually needed to say, what we would say, technical philosophy term, we needed a disjunction. We needed to say, if you are this or if you are that, then you are welcome. Equally welcome in both cases. So I think the wording we ended up coming with is that the march was for self-identifying women and anyone who, even though you might not identify as a woman, feels you're a target for misogynistic violence. And once we kind of hit on that wording, that like this or that seemed to solve the problem. And that got me thinking that maybe the reason we found it so tricky is because we started with the assumption that there was one definition that would capture everybody, whereas actually we needed sort of two definitions where satisfying either one of them, or obviously both, would be sufficient for you to be part of the constituency that was invited to take part in that particular political action. That said, at the time I wrote the paper, I was quite sympathetic to the idea that we can think of feminism as a struggle to kind of emancipate women, and that it was therefore very important to work out who was a woman for that purpose. I've since actually, because of other work, come to the view that that's maybe not the best way to think about feminism anyway. And once you do that, the kind of question of who is or isn't a woman becomes much less kind of politically urgent, which I think is to the good. I think that it's clear that gender harms all of us in different ways, and it harms people who are kind of feminized in broadly, where you thinking of that as kind of in a very broad way more. And I think that that's kind of enough to be cracking on with, to be honest. In terms of how my views have come on since I wrote the paper, I think I'm no less interested in this question, but I would want to answer it slightly differently now. So at the time I wrote the paper, I was kind of, those kind of two ways of thinking about gender would kind of cover all the bases. And I now really don't think that's true. I think we actually need a much more diverse range of different kind of senses of gender at our disposal in order to kind of fulfill all the different projects that we might want to pursue. I think that actually we're going to need to define gender a bit differently for different purposes, going even beyond those two things. So yeah, it's kind of got messier since I wrote that paper.
So sorry, just to I think we should linger there. That's really interesting. Would this be it still might not be that, even with adding on your kind of caveat, your kind of development of Haslanger's proposal to be more inclusive, that even this might still not be inclusive enough. It might not incorporate a wide enough conception of gender.
So I would maybe say that I got less interested in the idea of whether it's inclusive enough, but the idea of fluidity definitely is part of what I think was missing then. So there's another philosopher called Auster. She's Icelandic. She just, the way that names work in Iceland means it doesn't make sense to basically she just uses this single name, like Plato or something, like Auster. So Auster, in a book called Categories We Live By, has this really interesting vision of social categories in general. I'll use gender as an example. She thinks that they're very context dependent, so that what it is to occupy a certain category in one context is just going to be very different to what it is to occupy that category in another context. And so for Auster, for example, your gender changes as you walk into different rooms with different people, right? So she has this wonderful example in her book where she says, imagine that you work in an office, a software office, a tech office, a coding office in San Francisco, and in the office you're one of the guys, and then after work you go to a bar, and the bar is very heteronormative, and you're not really any gender in there because it doesn't, you're kind of an other. And then after that's done, you go to another bar, which is a lesbian bar, and in that bar you're a butch, and that's your gender there is butch, and you're expected to buy drinks for the femmes. And then you go home, or you go to a family party, and you're one of the women, and you need to be in the kitchen making sure all the food is ready. And so in a single day you have these genders, like kind of one of the guys, gender other, butch, woman. Your gender changes as you move through these different contexts, because the way that people are responding to you differs markedly between those contexts, and the kind of cues, the things about you that they're picking up on change too. So we can think of this as a very contextualist way of thinking about gender. On this view, gender is fluid, it shifts as you move between different social contexts. And I think that also captures something important about gender, and I'd want to add that to the picture. So yeah, gender being more fluid is definitely part of it. And then of course, any of those kind of social statuses that you have in those different contexts, coming back to this idea of ontic injustice, we could take issue with any of those, right? We could say, well, it's not fair that those are the expectations that are placed on me in this context, or that's oppressive. Like we want to object to it. And I think there's plenty of room to do that too.
Right. So I think this is time to end the podcast. We hope you enjoyed being here with us.
Certainly, this has been a really interesting conversation. Thanks for your questions.
I think we'll definitely need to schedule in another podcast at some point. There's so much more to ask and so much more to chat about here.
That's very true.
Sure, I'd love to talk to you again. That would be great.
All right, so thank you for being here, Katharine, and thank you for everyone who's been listening to us. See you next time.